At the dawn of the 17th century, India was not a poor land waiting to be exploited, it was one of the richest economic regions on earth. Contemporary travelers, merchants, and historians described the Indian subcontinent as a vast engine of production, trade, and innovation. Its cities bustled with commerce, its villages sustained complex agrarian systems, and its artisans produced goods that were unmatched in quality anywhere in the world. This was the India that European powers encountered, not a bankrupt nation, but a treasure house. India's wealth rested on a diverse and resilient economy. Agriculture formed the backbone, supported by advanced irrigation, seasonal planning, and state-managed land revenue systems. Beyond the fields, India's artisans dominated global manufacturing. Fine cotton textiles from Bengal, Coromandel, and Gujarat clothed populations across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Silk, indigo, spices, steel, and handicrafts flowed outward through land and sea routes that had existed for centuries. India did not merely participate in global trade, it anchored it. Crucially, this trade operated on India's terms. Indian merchants rarely needed foreign goods in exchange. European traders arrived with ships full of silver and gold because Indian products could not be bought any other way. From the Mughal courts to local markets, precious metals were the only universally accepted medium. As a result, silver flowed steadily into India, strengthening its monetary base and fueling internal commerce. This inward flow of bullion was a sign of economic power, not weakness. The Mughal Empire, at its height, provided political stability over vast territories. A sophisticated administrative system collected revenue, maintained infrastructure, and supported urban centers. Currency circulation was widespread, markets were integrated, and long-distance trade thrived. Unlike Europe, where capital was scarce and production limited, India enjoyed abundance of labor, skill, and output. By some modern estimates, India accounted for nearly a quarter of global GDP during this period. European observers were stunned. To them, India seemed impossibly wealthy. Markets overflowed with goods, wages supported large populations, and even common people owned items that Europeans considered luxuries. This perception would soon shape European strategy. The problem was simple: Europe wanted Indian goods, but had little India wanted in return. The solution, at first, was silver. But silver alone could not sustain Europe's growing appetite. The arrival of the European trading companies marked a turning point. The Portuguese came first, followed by the Dutch, French, and British. Initially, they were guests in an Indian-dominated trade network. They paid customs, followed local rules, and competed with Indian and Asian merchants. Their ships brought bullion, and their profits depended entirely on Indian producers. At this stage, the balance of power remained firmly in India's favor, yet beneath the surface, a transformation was beginning. European powers were learning. They studied Indian markets, mapped coastlines, forged alliances, and, most importantly, understood the central role of silver in India's economy. They realized that controlling the flow of silver, and the systems that demanded it, could mean controlling India itself. What began as trade would slowly evolve into extraction. By the late 17th century, subtle changes appeared. Trading companies sought monopolies, exclusive contracts, and political influence. They armed their ships, fortified their factories, and interfered in local disputes. These actions were justified as commercial necessities, but they carried deeper implications. The silver that once entered India freely would, in time, begin to leave under very different circumstances. This is where the story truly begins, not with conquest by armies, but with conquest by currency. Silver, the lifeblood of India's economy, would become the instrument of its undoing. To understand how a land so wealthy could be financially ruined, we must follow the metal itself, where it came from, how it moved, and who ultimately controlled it. In the next part, we will explore how European trade imbalances, global silver flows, and colonial ambition converged, setting the stage for one of the greatest economic reversals in human history. Long before European powers set their sights on India, silver had already begun reshaping the global economy. The discovery of vast silver mines in the Americas, most notably at Potosí in present-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico, triggered one of the largest movements of precious metal in human history. Spain and, later, other European powers extracted unimaginable quantities of silver, flooding global markets. Yet despite this abundance, Europe itself remained economically weak. Its industries were underdeveloped, its goods uncompetitive, and its demand for Asian products insatiable. Asia, and India in particular, became the primary destination for this silver. Indian textiles, spices, and manufactured goods were so highly valued that European traders had little choice but to pay in bullion. This created a persistent trade imbalance. Silver left Europe in massive quantities and entered India, China, and Southeast Asia. From a purely economic perspective, this imbalance reflected Asia's productive superiority. Wealth flowed toward those who produced what the world wanted. For India, the inflow of silver initially reinforced prosperity. Mughal currency systems absorbed the metal efficiently, minting it into rupees that circulated widely. Markets expanded, wages were paid, and taxes were collected in cash rather than kind. Unlike many pre-modern economies, India was highly monetized. Silver did not sit idle in treasuries, it moved constantly through hands, villages, and cities, binding the economy together. China, however, played a crucial indirect role in India's story. By the Ming and Qing periods, Chinese tax systems demanded payment in silver, creating an enormous and continuous demand. European traders soon realized that silver sent to India often found its way onward to China through Asian trade networks. India became both a destination and a conduit in a wider silver ecosystem. This interconnected system meant that control over silver flows equaled control over global trade itself. European powers understood the danger. As silver drained out of Europe, inflation rose, currencies destabilized, and states struggled to finance wars. Mercantilist thinking took hold, emphasizing hoarding bullion and maintaining favorable trade balances. India's role as a magnet for silver was no longer merely an economic curiosity, it was perceived as a strategic threat. If Europe could not reverse this flow, it would remain dependent and weak. This realization marked a fundamental shift in European behavior. Trade alone was no longer enough. To stop the outflow of silver, Europeans needed to change the rules of exchange. They needed to force India to accept European goods, manipulate prices, or extract wealth without payment. In short, they needed power, not just commercial access, but political and military leverage. The English East India Company, along with its Dutch and French counterparts, began to experiment with solutions. They sought monopolies over key commodities, suppressed competition, and pressured local rulers for concessions. Armed ships replaced merchant vessels, and fortified settlements replaced simple trading posts. Commerce became inseparable from coercion. At the same time, European companies carefully studied India's dependence on silver as currency. They recognized a vulnerability: if silver could be removed from circulation faster than it entered, the entire economic system could be destabilized. What had once been a symbol of India's strength could be transformed into a weapon against it. By the early 18th century, the balance was beginning to tilt. Europe had not yet conquered India, but it had identified the mechanism of conquest. Silver was no longer just payment, it was leverage. The stage was set for a dramatic reversal, where bullion would cease to flow into India and instead be extracted on an unprecedented scale. The next phase of this story unfolds in Bengal, one of the richest regions on Earth. There, European ambition would collide with local power struggles, turning commercial influence into outright domination, and transforming silver from lifeblood into drain. At the beginning of the 18th century, the English East India Company was still, at least in theory, a commercial organization. Its charter authorized trade, not conquest. Its agents were merchants, accountants, and ship captains, not governors or generals. Yet by mid-century, the company would command armies larger than those of many European states and rule vast territories of the Indian subcontinent. This transformation did not occur suddenly, nor was it inevitable. It was engineered, step by step, through a calculated fusion of commerce, coercion, and silver. The company's early frustrations were economic. Despite strong demand for Indian goods in Europe, profits were constrained by the need to pay in bullion. Silver continued to flow out of Britain, weakening its balance of payments and alarming policymakers at home. Every ship returning from India full of textiles represented wealth for British consumers, but also a net loss of precious metal for the state. For the company's directors, this contradiction became intolerable. To resolve it, company officials began to seek control rather than access. If Indian producers could be forced to accept company terms, prices could be driven down. If taxes could be collected locally and paid to the company, exports could be purchased without importing silver at all. In effect, the company aimed to make India pay for its own exploitation. This required political power, and political power required intervention in local affairs. The opportunity emerged from fragmentation. By the early 1700s, the Mughal Empire was weakening. Provincial governors, or nawabs, exercised increasing autonomy, while succession disputes and regional rivalries destabilized authority. The company exploited this environment skillfully. It presented itself as an ally, a financier, and sometimes a kingmaker, offering loans, military support, or trade privileges in exchange for concessions. In Bengal, the richest province of all, company influence grew rapidly. Bengal's fertile lands, dense population, and thriving textile industry generated enormous revenues. Control over Bengal meant control over silver flows, taxes, and production. Company agents embedded themselves in court politics, bribing officials, manipulating successions, and securing trade exemptions that undermined local merchants and the state treasury alike. What distinguished the East India Company from earlier foreign traders was its willingness to use violence systematically. Private armies, composed largely of Indian soldiers known as sepoys but commanded by British officers, enforced company interests. These forces were funded not by the British state, but by company revenues extracted locally. War, in this model, paid for itself. The decisive moment came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. Often portrayed as a military encounter, Plassey was, in reality, a financial coup. Through bribery and secret agreements, company officials neutralized key commanders in the Nawab of Bengal's army before the battle even began. The result was a swift and lopsided victory that placed the company in control of Bengal's ruler, and, soon after, its treasury. The consequences were immediate and profound. Vast quantities of silver, gold, and revenue were transferred to company hands. Bengal's treasury, accumulated over generations, was emptied. For the first time, silver began to flow out of India not as payment for goods, but as tribute extracted by a foreign corporate power. This marked a fundamental break in India's economic history. With control over revenue, the company no longer needed to bring silver into India. Taxes collected from Indian peasants financed the purchase of Indian goods, which were then exported to Europe for profit. The same silver was effectively counted twice, once as tax and again as trade gain, while India bore the cost. This mechanism lay at the heart of what would later be called the drain of wealth. The transformation of the company reshaped India's economy. Local merchants were sidelined, artisans were squeezed by low prices, and rulers lost fiscal autonomy. What had begun as trade had become rule. Silver, once the symbol of India's strength in global commerce, was now the chain binding its economy to foreign interests. In the next part, we will focus on Bengal itself, how the company's new power devastated one of the world's most prosperous regions, setting off a chain reaction of economic collapse, famine, and long-term impoverishment. When the East India Company formally acquired the Diwani rights of Bengal in 1765, the authority to collect land revenue, it crossed a historic threshold. For the first time, a foreign corporate entity directly controlled the fiscal heart of one of the richest regions in the world. Bengal was not merely another province, it was the economic crown jewel of India. Its rivers sustained fertile agriculture, its artisans powered global textile markets, and its treasury overflowed from decades of surplus. Within a single decade, this prosperity would unravel. The company's primary objective was not governance but extraction. Revenue collection was redesigned to maximize immediate returns, not long-term stability. Traditional systems that balanced state demand with agricultural capacity were discarded. Company officials, often ignorant of local conditions and motivated by short-term profit, imposed rigid cash demands. Taxes had to be paid in silver, regardless of harvest quality or market fluctuations. Failure meant confiscation, imprisonment, or worse. This shift had devastating consequences. Peasants were forced to sell crops prematurely to meet tax deadlines, flooding markets and collapsing prices. Moneylenders thrived, while cultivators sank into debt. The circulation of silver tightened rapidly. What little remained in villages was siphoned upward to company treasuries, then exported abroad. Bengal's internal economy, once fluid and resilient, began to seize up. Artisans suffered alongside farmers. Bengal's textile industry had long depended on advances, local credit, and stable demand. Under company rule, weavers were coerced into exclusive contracts that fixed prices far below market rates. Payment was often delayed or made in depreciated currency. Skilled craftsmen abandoned looms, fled villages, or fell into poverty. A globally dominant manufacturing sector was systematically dismantled. The company's dual role as tax collector and merchant created a fatal conflict of interest. Revenue extracted from Bengal financed company purchases of Bengal goods. Those goods were exported for profit, while the region itself was left cash-starved. Silver no longer circulated locally, it drained outward. This was not accidental mismanagement, it was structural exploitation. The human cost became impossible to ignore during the famine of 1770. A combination of poor harvests and rigid revenue demands turned scarcity into catastrophe. Even as crops failed, taxes were not reduced. Grain was exported, hoarded, or sold at prices ordinary people could not afford. Contemporary accounts describe villages emptied, fields abandoned, and corpses lining roads. An estimated 10 million people, roughly a third of Bengal's population, perished, yet company revenues barely declined. In some districts, they even increased. This stark contrast revealed the true nature of the new system. It was designed to extract wealth irrespective of human survival. Silver continued to flow out of Bengal, even as the economy collapsed beneath it. The aftermath was irreversible. Population loss reduced agricultural output for years. Skilled labor disappeared. Local markets never fully recovered their pre-company vitality. Bengal, once a net contributor to global wealth, was transformed into a dependent, impoverished region. The collapse set a precedent that would be repeated across India. For Britain, the results were transformative. Profits extracted from Bengal helped stabilize British finances, fund industrial expansion, and support imperial wars. The same silver that had once flowed into India now underwrote Britain's rise as a global power. Bengal paid the price. This was not merely a regional tragedy, it was a blueprint. What happened in Bengal would soon be applied elsewhere through new revenue systems, land settlements, and economic controls. In the next part, we will examine how these policies were institutionalized, turning extraction into administration and ensuring that the drain of silver became permanent. After the devastation of Bengal, the East India Company faced a critical choice. It could reform its methods to stabilize the economy it now ruled, or it could refine extraction into a permanent system. It chose the latter. What had begun as improvised exploitation was gradually transformed into formal administration. Revenue policies were standardized, codified, and enforced across large parts of India, ensuring that the flow of silver outward would not be interrupted again. The center of this transformation were new land revenue systems. British administrators viewed land not as a social foundation, but as a financial asset. Their goal was predictability, a steady, guaranteed stream of cash revenue payable in silver. Traditional arrangements, where taxes fluctuated with harvests and were mediated by local institutions, were dismissed as inefficient and unreliable. In their place came rigid assessments backed by law and force. The first major experiment was the Permanent Settlement of 1793 in Bengal. Under this system, land revenue was fixed permanently and assigned to zamindars, who were turned into private landlords responsible for delivering a fixed amount of cash to the company each year. Failure meant loss of land through auction. The policy was celebrated in Britain as enlightened reform, but on the ground it proved disastrous. Zamindars squeezed cultivators mercilessly, while peasants bore all the risk of crop failure. Revenue remained constant even when food production collapsed. Elsewhere, different systems emerged with the same underlying logic. In the Ryotwari system, implemented in parts of southern and western India, the state collected revenue directly from individual peasants. In theory, this eliminated intermediaries. In practice, it subjected cultivators to relentless pressure. Assessments were high, surveys were inflexible, and payment in cash was mandatory. The Mahalwari system in northern India extended similar demands to entire villages. Across all variants, the objective was identical: extract maximum silver with minimum administrative cost. These systems reshaped rural society. Subsistence farming gave way to cash crop dependence as peasants were forced to grow indigo, cotton, or opium to earn money for taxes. Food security weakened. Local grain reserves disappeared. Debt became endemic, binding generations of cultivators to moneylenders and landlords. The countryside was monetized, but without prosperity. Silver circulated briefly before being drained upward and outward. The colonial state enforced this machinery with unprecedented coercive power. Courts, police, and prisons ensured compliance. Land became alienable property for the first time, enabling mass dispossession. Millions lost ancestral holdings and became tenants or laborers. Revenue collection, once embedded in social obligation, became an impersonal extraction enforced by law. Crucially, these policies also transformed India's relationship to global trade. India was no longer an exporter earning silver, it was a source of raw materials feeding British industry. Cotton went to Lancashire, indigo dyed European cloth, and opium was sold to China in exchange for tea. The silver earned from these trades rarely returned to Indian markets. It passed through company accounts into Britain's financial system. By the mid-19th century, the pattern was entrenched. Even after the British Crown replaced the company in 1858, the revenue machinery remained intact. Administrators spoke of order and improvement, but the economic logic never changed. India consistently exported more than it imported, yet remained starved of capital. The surplus was invisible, transferred through accounting rather than ships. This was the mature phase of the drain. Silver no longer needed to be physically shipped in large quantities. It was extracted through budget surpluses, remittances, pensions, and interest payments. India paid for its own governance, its own army, and the profits of its rulers. Poverty was no longer a temporary crisis, it was structural. In the next part, we will examine the cultural and economic consequences of this system, how India's industries were destroyed, how skills were lost, and how deindustrialization locked the country into a subordinate role in the global economy. For centuries before colonial rule, India was one of the world's great manufacturing centers. Its textile industry alone employed millions, producing cottons and silks that were prized from Southeast Asia to Europe. Indian steel, shipbuilding, paper, glass, and handicrafts sustained complex urban economies. Manufacturing was not a marginal activity, it was central to livelihoods, trade, and social stability. Colonial rule would dismantle this system with devastating speed. The process of deindustrialization did not occur because Indian goods were inferior or outdated. On the contrary, Indian textiles remained competitive well into the 19th century. The destruction was political and economic, not technological. British policy deliberately restructured India's economy to serve the needs of Britain's Industrial Revolution, and silver was the mechanism through which this transformation was enforced. Tariff policy played a critical role. In Britain, Indian textiles were subjected to heavy duties or outright bans to protect domestic producers. In India, British manufactured cloth entered with little or no tariff protection for local industry. The result was asymmetrical competition. Indian weavers faced falling prices for their output while being forced to buy increasingly expensive imported goods. Silver that might have circulated locally now flowed outward to pay for British manufactures. At the same time, company control over revenue and credit strangled artisans. Weavers had traditionally relied on advances from merchants and steady demand. Under colonial rule, these networks collapsed. Company agents dictated prices, delayed payments, and enforced exclusive contracts. Many artisans were pushed into debt or abandoned their crafts entirely. Skills passed down for generations disappeared within decades. Urban manufacturing centers declined rapidly. Cities that had thrived on production and trade, Murshidabad, Dhaka, Surat, lost population and economic relevance. Workshops closed, looms fell silent, and auxiliary trades vanished. Deindustrialization was not confined to textiles. Metalworking, shipbuilding, and other crafts suffered similar fates as British imports displaced local goods. This transformation reshaped India's labor structure. Millions who had once earned cash incomes from manufacturing were forced back onto the land. Agriculture became overcrowded, productivity declined, and wages fell. The countryside absorbed the shock of industrial collapse, intensifying poverty and vulnerability to famine. Silver scarcity deepened as fewer people earned monetary incomes. British industry, meanwhile, flourished. Raw cotton from India fed Lancashire mills, where it was transformed into cloth and sold back to Indian consumers at a profit. The same population that had once produced textiles was now reduced to buying them, financed by taxes extracted in silver. India became both supplier and captive market. Colonial administrators often portrayed deindustrialization as a natural transition, arguing that India was moving from manufacturing to agriculture. In reality, it was a forced regression. No alternative industries were allowed to develop, no protective policies were offered, and no investment was made in Indian industrial capacity. Capital drained out faster than it could be formed. By the late 19th century, the consequences were unmistakable. India's share of global manufacturing output collapsed from roughly a quarter to a few percent. Poverty was widespread, urban centers stagnated, and economic diversity disappeared. The silver drain was now reinforced by structural dependency. India could not industrialize because its surplus was continuously extracted. This destruction of industry was not collateral damage, it was central to imperial strategy. A deindustrialized India posed no competition to Britain and ensured a steady flow of raw materials and revenue. The cost was borne by millions whose livelihoods vanished without replacement. In the next part, we will explore how these economic transformations translated into recurring crises, famines, currency shortages, and social breakdown, revealing the human toll of silver-driven exploitation. One of the most enduring myths of colonial history is that India's 19th-century famines were natural disasters, inevitable consequences of drought, monsoon failure, or overpopulation. In reality, scarcity had existed for centuries without producing mass death on this scale. What changed under colonial rule was not the climate, but the economic system. Famines became frequent, severe, and lethal because the silver-driven machinery of extraction stripped society of its resilience. Before colonial domination, Indian communities relied on layered safety nets. Grain was stored locally, prices were regulated in times of scarcity, and state authorities reduced taxes during bad harvests. Relief was imperfect, but survival was the priority. Under British rule, these mechanisms were dismantled or ignored. The market was allowed, indeed forced, to operate without restraint, even when lives were at stake. Currency played a central role in this breakdown. As silver drained from the countryside, peasants and laborers found themselves unable to buy food even when it existed. Grain continued to be exported from famine-stricken regions to meet revenue targets or commercial contracts. Hunger was not caused by the absence of food, but by the absence of money. Colonial administrators themselves acknowledged this paradox, yet refused to alter policy. Between 1800 and 1900, India experienced a succession of catastrophic famines: 1837–38, 1860–61, 1876–78, 1896–97, and 1899–1900. Together, they claimed tens of millions of lives. In each case, rigid revenue demands, cash-based taxation, and unrestricted grain exports magnified environmental stress into mass death. Silver continued to flow outward even as people starved. The famine of 1876–78 illustrates the system at its most brutal. Large parts of southern and western India suffered drought, yet exports of grain reached record levels. Relief was deliberately limited to avoid market distortion. Starving people were forced into labor camps where food was exchanged for exhausting work. Mortality soared. While colonial budgets remained balanced, these crises tore apart the social fabric. Families sold land, tools, and livestock to survive. communities fragmented as people migrated in search of work or food. Traditional occupations vanished, and dependence on wage labor increased. Debt deepened across generations. Famine was no longer an exceptional event, it became a recurring feature of colonial life. The psychological impact was profound. Trust in institutions collapsed. The colonial state came to be seen not as protector, but as extractor, an authority that demanded silver even in death. Popular resistance, migration, and social unrest followed, laying the groundwork for future political movements. British officials often blamed Indian society itself, citing alleged laziness, ignorance, or overpopulation. Such explanations obscured the structural reality. India was producing surplus, enough to feed its population and export abroad, but that surplus was diverted. The drain of silver transformed abundance into catastrophe. By the end of the 19th century, famine had become normalized. Mortality on a scale once unthinkable was treated as a statistical problem rather than a moral crisis. This normalization revealed the ultimate consequence of economic extraction, a system in which human life was subordinate to fiscal balance and imperial profit. In the next part, we will turn outward, to Britain itself, and examine how India's suffering financed industrial growth, imperial power, and global dominance. The silver drain from India did not vanish, it built an empire. While India endured deindustrialization, famine, and chronic poverty, a very different transformation was unfolding thousands of miles away. Britain was rising, economically, militarily, and politically. The Industrial Revolution reshaped its society, turning a small island nation into the world's dominant imperial power. This ascent is often attributed to innovation, entrepreneurship, and institutions. Yet one critical factor is frequently minimized: the steady flow of wealth extracted from India. By the late 18th century, India had become Britain's single most important overseas possession, not because of settlement or migration, but because of revenue. Taxes collected in India paid for the administration of India itself, freeing British taxpayers from the cost of empire. More importantly, large portions of this revenue were transferred to Britain through company remittances, pensions, interest payments, and trade surpluses. Silver did not merely leave India, it entered Britain's financial bloodstream. These transfers stabilized Britain's balance of payments at a crucial moment. Britain imported food, raw materials, and luxury goods from across the world, often running trade deficits. Indian surpluses quietly offset these gaps. Economists later described India as Britain's hidden subsidy, allowing it to consume more than it produced without suffering financial collapse. Indian wealth also financed war. From the late 18th to the mid-19th century, Britain fought a near-continuous series of conflicts: the Napoleonic Wars, colonial wars in Asia and Africa, and naval expansion across the globe. Indian revenues paid for large portions of the British Indian Army, which was deployed not only within India but across the empire. Indian soldiers, funded by Indian taxes, helped secure British dominance worldwide. Capital extracted from India flowed into Britain's growing financial markets. Banks, insurance firms, and joint stock companies expanded with this influx. Railways, factories, and urban infrastructure benefited indirectly from imperial revenues that reduced risk and expanded credit. Britain's industrial takeoff occurred in a world where capital accumulation was accelerated by empire. Meanwhile, India was denied the same opportunities. Railways built in India primarily served imperial needs, moving troops, raw materials, and exports, not industrial development. Profits from these projects were guaranteed to British investors, with returns paid out of Indian revenues. Even infrastructure became a mechanism of extraction. By the mid-19th century, the contrast was stark. Britain's per capita income rose steadily, while India's stagnated or declined. British cities expanded, wages improved, and industrial employment grew. In India, overcrowded agriculture, underemployment, and poverty persisted. The divergence was not accidental, it was relational. Britain's rise and India's impoverishment were two sides of the same historical process. Colonial narratives celebrated empire as a civilizing mission, claiming that Britain brought progress to India. Yet the economic record tells a different story. India financed Britain's modernization while being denied its benefits. Silver that once circulated through Indian markets now underwrote British prosperity. This dynamic shaped global inequality in lasting ways. The industrialized West surged ahead, while colonized regions fell behind. The gap between rich and poor nations widened dramatically during this period, and India's experience was central to that transformation. In the next part, we will confront the myths that sustained imperial rule, examining how economic exploitation was justified, denied, or reframed as benevolence, even as its consequences became impossible to ignore. As the economic consequences of colonial rule became increasingly visible, British administrators, scholars, and politicians faced a dilemma. The reality of extraction, poverty, famine, deindustrialization, and recurring crisis stood in sharp contrast to the moral image Britain wished to project. To sustain imperial authority, exploitation had to be reframed. Thus emerged the powerful myth of benevolent rule. Colonial ideology portrayed British governance as rational, scientific, and progressive. Railways, canals, courts, and education were presented as gifts bestowed upon a backward society. Economic suffering was attributed to India's own supposed failures: overpopulation, superstition, laziness, or an inability to adapt to modernity. The drain of silver was rarely acknowledged, and when it was dismissed as either exaggerated or necessary. British economic thinkers often argued that India benefited indirectly from empire. Revenues sent to Britain were described as payment for administration, defense, and investment. This logic ignored a fundamental asymmetry. India paid for services designed primarily to secure British interests. The army defended imperial frontiers, not Indian prosperity. Infrastructure facilitated extraction, not development. Silver flowed outward regardless of local need. Education policy reinforced this narrative. Colonial curricula emphasized British history, political thought, and economic theory while marginalizing India's own past. Generations of Indians were taught to view poverty as destiny rather than design. This intellectual colonization was as important as economic control, shaping how exploitation was understood, or misunderstood, yet dissenting voices existed. Indian thinkers such as Dadabhai Naoroji systematically documented the drain of wealth, using British statistics to expose contradictions in imperial claims. He argued that India's poverty was not ancient or inevitable, but produced by policies that transferred surplus abroad. His work challenged the moral foundation of empire and inspired early nationalist movements. Within Britain itself, critics also emerged. Some administrators and journalists acknowledged famine mismanagement and economic injustice. However, these critiques rarely translated into structural reform. The imperial system depended on the drain. To end it would have required dismantling empire itself. As the 20th century approached, contradictions intensified. India supplied troops, resources, and revenue during global conflicts, particularly the First World War. Expectations of reform rose, but economic extraction continued. Silver still flowed outward through budgets, pensions, and remittances. The language of benevolence increasingly rang hollow. The Great Depression further exposed the fragility of the colonial economy. Falling prices devastated Indian producers, while fixed revenue demands persisted. Poverty deepened, and political resistance intensified. The myth of benevolent rule could no longer fully contain popular anger. By the 1930s and 1940s, mass movements openly challenged imperial legitimacy. Economic exploitation was no longer an abstract critique but a lived reality for millions. Independence was demanded not only as political freedom, but as economic survival. In the final part, we will examine the long shadow of the silver drain, how colonial extraction shaped post-independence India, constrained development, and left legacies that continue to influence the present. When India achieved independence in 1947, it did not inherit a neutral economic landscape. It emerged from colonial rule deeply impoverished, structurally distorted, and capital-starved. The silver drain had ended in formal terms, but its consequences were embedded in institutions, infrastructure, and social conditions. Independence marked political freedom, not economic reset. At the moment of departure, Britain transferred power, but not wealth. India's foreign exchange reserves were minimal, industrial capacity was weak, and literacy rates were among the lowest in the world. The manufacturing base that had once made India a global leader had been dismantled, and domestic capital accumulation had been suppressed for generations. The starting line was profoundly unequal. Post-independence leaders faced an enormous challenge, rebuilding an economy that had been systematically drained. Industrialization became a priority, not as ideology but as necessity. Planning, public investment, and state-led development were adopted to compensate for the absence of private capital. These choices are often criticized in isolation, yet they cannot be understood without recognizing the historical vacuum created by colonial extraction. The legacy of Silver Drain also shaped India's global position. Former imperial powers entered the post-war world with capital, technology, and established industries. India entered with debt, underemployment, and fragile institutions. International trade rules, financial systems, and geopolitical power structures reflected this imbalance, making catch-up development extraordinarily difficult. Social consequences persisted as well. Chronic poverty, inequality, and regional disparities were not erased by independence. Rural distress, urban overcrowding, and informal labor reflected centuries of distorted economic incentives. Education and health systems had to be built almost from scratch for a vast population that had been denied investment, yet the story is not one of permanence or inevitability. Over time, India rebuilt. Industry expanded, agriculture recovered, and a domestic market re-emerged. The very resilience that once made India wealthy reasserted itself under new conditions. But recovery was slow, uneven, and constrained by the inherited legacy of extraction. Understanding this history matters today. Narratives that attribute modern inequality solely to culture, governance, or policy choices ignore the accumulated effects of colonial drain. Wealth is not created or destroyed in isolation, it is transferred. The silver that once flowed out of India helped shape the modern world, leaving behind imbalances that still define global relations. The story of India's financial ruin is therefore not merely a story of the past. It is a reminder that economic systems have moral consequences, and that prosperity built on extraction leaves lasting scars. Acknowledging this history is not about assigning guilt, it is about understanding causation. As we look at the modern global economy, echoes of the silver drain remain visible: unequal trade, capital flight, and development gaps between nations. India's experience offers a powerful lens through which to examine these patterns, and to question narratives that separate wealth from history. The silver is gone, but its shadow remains. To tell this story fully is not to dwell on loss, but to reclaim memory. Only by understanding how wealth was taken can societies understand how it might one day be restored.